Now by removing the content presenter and replacing it with this text block, I've made one fundamental change to this checkbox. Since it no longer has a content presenter, I can't do that neat little function where I added a button or added geometry into the checkbox because I don't have a content presenter anymore. So let's go ahead, I'm going to change the foreground, and I want kind of a darker red. Because unfortunately if I go with a bright red, it can sometimes be tricky to see the text. I'm going to scroll down, and once again, my margin has been set, so I need to reset that. And I want to make sure my text is centered, so I'm going to keep scrolling down and set the justification to centered. Now I'm set for how my control is going to look. I'm going to add a property trigger so that when this control is checked, I want a different set of properties. So let me click Add Property to create a new property trigger, and I'm going to slide down my object and timeline tree a little bit and slide up this separator so I can see all my triggers. Now I want to work with my target element, and I want to know when it's checked. I want to have different values. So my property is when the target element is checked, I want to take on this set of properties. Easily enough, I just need to go over to my property inspector, scroll up, and change my foreground from red to green. Now let's take a look when I press F5 how my checkbox behaves. At the moment I've got red text, and as soon as I click it, it switches to green. I can click it again, and every time I click, the isChecked property is changing, and as soon as it changes, all the necessary values underneath get modified for me. Now, I'm going to scope up to switch back to my main application, and I've got my checkbox selected, and I want to change a property. I don't want to see my value, I want to say hungry. This is a checkbox perhaps for my user to indicate whether or not they're hungry, and maybe it's a message for my office manager to go get me some food. Now when I press return, the value doesn't change. This is the same concept that we saw before with the background and the border brush on the button. I need to template bind the text of my text element to the content of my checkbox. When I do that, I need to remember that the content of my checkbox can only be straight text. If I were to change it so that that content was something else, it would try to apply my geometry or my control to the text of my text field, and I'll get some rather unusual results. So let's go back into my checkbox and go ahead and modify the template again. All I need to do is select my text block, click on the property marker, and template bind. Now when I look at the template bind list here, I see a rather long list of all the properties. What's happening is just about every property in the Windows Presentation Foundation can be converted into a string one way or another. So every single property that can be converted to a string is displayed here. And at the bottom, you'll see a small black rectangle that allows me to scroll the list to find even more of my properties. As soon as I scroll down a little bit, a similar arrow appears at the top. Conveniently though, the property I'm looking for, the content, is displayed, so I can just click it and select it. And now, immediately, the property that was specified on my parent template binds down. Now I didn't really point this out too heavily when we were dealing with the colors, but if you notice here, my property in the property inspector has taken on a yellow border. When we were doing data binding, the yellow border indicated that this value was data bound somewhere else. In this case, I can click on the property marker, and when I go to template binding, you'll see that the content property has a check next to it. The yellow border indicates that I'm either data bound or template bound, and when I go on template binding, I can see the check to see which property I'm bound to. This allows you to easily backtrack and find out what is associated with what, so I can make the necessary modifications. Now let's go one step further. I'm going to switch back to my selection tool. The grid is my currently selected element, and I'm going to shrink the height of my first text block a little bit. I'm going to enlarge my grid by a bit, and I'm going to add another text block. Now, I don't care what the text is. I'm just going to hit escape, and I'm going to drag the top of it down so that it's adjacent to my first text block. So now I've got two text blocks here within my one control. What can I do with this? Well, I'm going to bind the text here, template bind it, and I'm going to drag down to the tag property. The tag is a generic property that nearly every Windows Presentation Foundation control has, and it's just a location where you can stick some more data. Now I'm going to reset my margins so everything goes back to where it's supposed to be. And now I'm going to scope up and set the tag property on my checkbox. Now I need to make this a little bit taller because now that I've got two fields in there, I need to make sure there's enough room. Now I don't remember where the tag property is, so I'm going to go up to my search bar and just type tag so it can find it for me. Now as soon as I type text in here, press return, and that field gets entered. So I can modify the visuals of my entire control based on any number of properties. And in fact, if you remember our discussion on dependency properties earlier, I could even create my own properties to change some of these values. For instance, if I wanted to, I could create a dependency property for what color my text should be if it's true, and what color it should be when it's false, and go ahead and make those changes.